She lowered her drawers in the dust. He gasped. "Sweet Jesus, your trouble." Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the empty road, watching the dust swirl around her worn boots. The sun blazed overhead like an angry eye, turning the Oklahoma landscape into something that looked more like the surface of the moon than farmland. She was 19 years old, and everything she owned in the world fit inside a canvas satchel that had once belonged to her mother. The year was 1935, and the Dust Bowl had turned the Great Plains into a wasteland. Sarah's family farm, the place where she had spent every day of her life until 3 weeks ago, was gone. Not sold, not abandoned by choice, but simply claimed by the dust. The crops had failed for the third year in a row. The animals had either died or been sold off for pennies. Her father had taken to drinking whatever rot-gut liquor he could find, sitting in the barn and staring at nothing for hours. Her younger brothers and sisters had been sent away to live with relatives scattered across 3 different states, families that could barely feed themselves but took the children in anyway because that's what people did. Sarah had refused to be a burden to anyone. She had heard the stories, the rumors that drifted back from the West like whispered prayers. California. Land of oranges and opportunity. Places where the sun shone but the rain still fell. Orchards that needed workers. Farms that paid real wages. She knew the stories were probably exaggerated, probably too good to be true, but what choice did she have? Stay in Oklahoma and watch her father drink himself to death? Marry Billy Henderson, the neighbor boy who had asked her 3 times and whose family farm was in the same desperate shape as her own? No. Sarah had packed her bag in the dark hours before dawn, left a note on the kitchen table, and started walking west on Route 66. That had been 3 weeks ago. She had learned quickly that the road was not kind to young women traveling alone. She had learned to keep her eyes down, to accept rides only from families or older couples, to sleep in church basements when she could, and under bridges when she couldn't. She had learned that hunger was something you could get used to, that a single apple could be stretched across an entire day if you were disciplined about it. But one thing she hadn't planned for was her undergarments giving out. It seemed like such a small thing, such a trivial concern in the face of everything else. But when the seam on her only decent pair of drawers had ripped that morning, ripped so badly that they were unwearable, Sarah had felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since leaving home. She had one more pair in her satchel, but they were threadbare and had holes in places that made them embarrassing to wear. Still, she had no choice. She had been walking for 2 hours without seeing a single car when she spotted the old truck. It was pulled off to the side of the road, rusted and clearly abandoned, probably left there by some family that couldn't afford to fix it and couldn't afford to tow it either. The truck sat about 20 yards from the road, offering just enough privacy. Sarah looked up and down the empty highway. Nothing. No cars, no people, just the endless stretch of dust-covered asphalt and the skeletal remains of failed farms on either side. She made her decision quickly, grabbing her satchel and hurrying toward the truck. Behind the vehicle hidden from the road, she set down her bag and began the awkward process of changing. The Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her back. She was focused entirely on the task, fumbling with the worn fabric, when she heard the footsteps. "Well, I'll be—" Sarah's head snapped up. A man stood at the corner of the truck, frozen in mid-step, his eyes wide with shock. He was tall, lean in the way that spoke of missed meals rather than natural build, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. He wore work pants held up with suspenders, and a shirt that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric had been. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation, her hands frozen in place. The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Sweet Jesus," he finally managed, his voice hoarse with embarrassment. "Your trouble." It wasn't said cruelly. In fact, there was something almost admiring in his tone, mixed with the shock. He immediately turned his back to her, raising his hands as if to prove he meant no harm. "I'm sorry, miss. I'm real sorry. I was just looking for parts, maybe a spare tire. I didn't think anyone was here. I'll just go back to the road and wait. You take your time." Sarah should have been terrified. She should have screamed or run or done any of the things a sensible young woman alone on the road should do when encountering a strange man. But something in his voice, in the genuine mortification she heard there, made her pause. "Wait," she heard herself say, surprised by her own boldness. She quickly finished dressing, her hands shaking slightly. "You can turn around now. I'm decent." The man turned slowly, his face still flushed red beneath the dust and stubble. He kept his eyes carefully fixed on a point somewhere above her left shoulder. "I truly am sorry, miss. That was not how I intended to spend my afternoon, I assure you." Despite everything, the humiliation, the fear, the sheer absurdity of the situation, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. It came out as a half-sob, half-giggle that sounded slightly hysterical even to her own ears. "I suppose it wasn't how I intended to spend mine either," she said. The man's lips twitched, and then he was laughing too, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. They stood there behind the abandoned truck, two strangers in the dust, laughing at the sheer ridiculous awfulness of life during the Dust Bowl. "Jack Thornton," the man said when the laughter finally died down, extending his hand but still maintaining a respectful distance. "And I promise I'm not usually in the habit of sneaking up on ladies in states of undress." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was calloused and strong, the hand of someone who knew hard work. "And I'm not usually in the habit of changing clothes behind abandoned trucks, so I suppose we're even." Jack nodded toward the road. "You traveling alone?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. There didn't seem to be much point in lying when he had already found her alone in the middle of nowhere. Jack's expression grew serious. "That's dangerous, Miss Mitchell. There are bad people on this road. People who would take advantage of a young woman alone." "I know," Sarah said quietly, "but I don't have much choice. I'm headed to California. There's supposed to be work there." Jack let out a long breath, looking up and down the empty highway. "California? Everyone's headed to California. You got people there? Family waiting for you?" "No," Sarah admitted. "But I've got nothing keeping me in Oklahoma either." Something flickered in Jack's eyes, something that looked like recognition or understanding. He studied her for a long moment, and Sarah found herself studying him right back. He didn't look dangerous, not really. He looked tired and worn down and a little bit broken, but not dangerous. There was something in his eyes that seemed almost kind beneath all the dust and weariness. "I've got a car," Jack said finally. "Well, calling it a car is being generous. It's more like a collection of spare parts, held together by prayer and baling wire, but it runs mostly. I'm headed west, too. You're welcome to ride along if you want." Sarah knew she should say no. Every sensible bone in her body screamed that getting into a car with a strange man was asking for trouble. But she looked at the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions, felt the weight of her satchel and the many miles still ahead of her, and thought about that word Jack had used, trouble. Maybe trouble was exactly what she needed. "All right," she said. "But just to the next town. And if you try anything inappropriate, I've got a knife in my bag." She didn't actually have a knife, but Jack didn't need to know that. Jack's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Fair enough, Miss Mitchell. My car's back on the road, about a quarter mile that way. And for what it's worth, my mother raised me right. You'll be safe." As they walked back toward the highway, Sarah carrying her satchel and Jack keeping a respectful distance beside her, she wondered if this was the smartest decision she had ever made or the dumbest. Either way, it was done now. She had lowered her guard quite literally, and the stranger had stumbled into her life in the most mortifying way possible. Little did she know that this embarrassing moment in the dust would become the story she would tell for the rest of her life, the moment when everything changed, when two desperate souls found each other on a forgotten stretch of highway in the worst years America had ever known. Jack's car was exactly as he had described it, a battered Ford that looked like it had survived several wars and lost most of them. The paint had faded to a color that might once have been blue or green but was now mostly rust. One of the doors was held shut with rope, and the passenger window was missing entirely, replaced with a piece of cardboard that flapped in the hot breeze. "She's not much to look at," Jack said, patting the hood with something that almost resembled affection. "But she's gotten me this far. That counts for something." Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, which had springs poking through the worn fabric. She set her satchel on her lap and watched as Jack worked the crank to start the engine. It took 3 tries, but eventually the motor coughed to life with a sound like an old man clearing his throat. They drove in silence for the first hour. Sarah kept her eyes on the landscape rolling past, the endless fields of dust and the occasional skeleton of a farmhouse standing lonely against the horizon. Jack kept both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Jack spoke. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but what made you leave? Oklahoma, I mean. You said you had nothing keeping you there, but that's not quite the same as wanting to leave." Sarah considered not answering. She had spent 3 weeks keeping her story to herself, building walls around the pain of leaving. But something about Jack's voice, about the genuine curiosity without judgment, made her want to talk. "My family had a farm," she began slowly. 40 acres. Not much, but it was ours. My grandfather cleared that land with his own hands, built the house board by board. My father was born in that house. So was I. She paused, watching a dust devil spin across the empty field beside the road. The dust took it all. 3 years of no rain, just wind and dirt. The crops died. The animals died. My mother died, too, 2 winters ago. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I think it was really just heartbreak. Jack didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty sympathy. He just listened, and somehow that made it easier to continue. My father, he just gave up, started drinking, stopped caring about anything. My brothers and sisters got sent to relatives in Kansas and Missouri. I could have gone too, could have lived with my aunt in Topeka. But I couldn't stand the thought of being someone's burden, someone's extra mouth to feed when they were already struggling. Sarah turned to look at Jack. So I left. Figured if I was going to be desperate and poor, I might as well do it somewhere with opportunity. Jack nodded slowly. That takes courage, leaving everything you know. Or stupidity, Sarah said with a bitter laugh. I'm not sure which yet. Maybe both, Jack said. Most brave things are a little stupid when you really think about them. They drove through a small town that looked like it was dying on its feet. Boarded up shops lined the main street. A few people sat on porches, watching the car pass with hollow eyes. Jack didn't stop. What about you? Sarah asked. What's your story? You said you're headed west, too. Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like the words hurt coming out. I was married, he said. 5 years. Her name was Margaret. We lived in Chicago. I worked at a factory making parts for automobiles. Good job, steady pay. We had a little apartment near the lake. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. He paused, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then the depression hit, factory closed. I couldn't find work, not real work anyway, just odd jobs here and there, never enough. Margaret. She tried to be patient, but I could see it wearing on her. The way she looked at me changed. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was just another mouth to feed, another problem to solve. Sarah heard the pain beneath the words, the kind of pain that comes from failure, from not being able to provide. She left? Sarah asked softly. Eventually. Met a man who still had a job, still had prospects. Can't say I blamed her, really. I wasn't much of a husband by the end. Jack cleared his throat. But that's not the worst of it. I had a younger brother, Danny. He was working construction. Dangerous work, but it paid. I was supposed to meet him one day for lunch, but I was hungover, feeling sorry for myself, and I didn't show up. That afternoon, scaffolding collapsed at his work site. Danny was on it. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Jack, I'm sorry. He lived for 3 days in the hospital. I sat with him the whole time, holding his hand, telling him it would be okay. But it wasn't okay. He died, and I wasn't even there when it happened. I'd gone to get coffee. Jack's voice cracked slightly. The worst part is, if I'd shown up for lunch like I was supposed to, he would have been with me instead of on that scaffolding. He'd still be alive. You can't know that, Sarah said gently. Maybe not. But I think about it every day. Jack took a shaky breath. After he died, after the funeral, I couldn't stay in Chicago anymore. Everything reminded me of my failures. Failed husband, failed brother, failed man. So I got in this car and started driving. Didn't much care where I ended up. They fell back into silence, but it was different now. It was the silence of two people who had shared their wounds with each other, who had shown their scars. Sarah understood now why Jack had that look in his eyes, that mixture of sadness and determination. He wasn't just running away. He was trying to outrun his guilt. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the dusty sky in shades of orange and red, Jack pulled off the road in a small town in the Texas Panhandle. The town wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a diner, a gas station, and a church. We should stop for the night, Jack said. I know a place where we can sleep safe. Church basement. The pastor here, he's good people. Lets travelers stay if they need to. Sarah nodded, grateful. Her body ached from the long day of travel, and her stomach had been complaining loudly for the past 2 hours. The pastor was indeed good people, as Jack had promised. Reverend Thomas was a small man with kind eyes and hands stained with soil from his garden. He welcomed them without questions, showed them to the church basement where several other travelers had already set up for the night, and brought them bowls of thin soup and hard bread. It's not much, Reverend Thomas apologized, but it's hot and it's filling. It's wonderful, Sarah said honestly. After 3 weeks of apples and whatever she could beg or barter for, the soup tasted like the finest meal she'd ever eaten. That night, sleeping on a thin blanket on the church floor with a dozen other strangers nearby. Sarah thought about the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday morning, she had been alone on the road, desperate and scared. Now she had a traveling companion, someone who understood what it meant to be broken and still keep moving forward. Jack slept a respectful distance away, his coat rolled up as a pillow. In the dim light from the single bulb hanging in the stairwell, Sarah could see his face looked younger in sleep, less burdened. She wondered what he had been like before everything fell apart, before the factory closed and his wife left and his brother died. She wondered what she had been like, too, before the dust came. The next morning, they continued west. Jack stopped at a gas station where he knew the owner, a gruff man named Pete, who owed him a favor. While Pete filled the tank, Jack disappeared around the back of the building. He returned, carrying 2 apples and a chunk of cheese wrapped in paper. Pete's wife packed us lunch, he explained, dividing the food carefully into 2 equal portions. They drove through the day, sharing stories about their childhoods, about the world before the Depression, about dreams they'd once had that seemed impossible now. Sarah told Jack about wanting to be a teacher, about how she'd loved school and had been top of her class. Jack told her about wanting to be an engineer, designing bridges and buildings. Seems silly now, Jack said, dreaming about building things when the whole country is falling apart. It's not silly, Sarah insisted. Dreams are what keep us going. Without them, we're just surviving, not living. Jack glanced at her, and something in his expression softened. You're wise for 19, you know that? I'm old for 19, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. They reached New Mexico by the 3rd day of traveling together. Jack found work at a garage fixing engines for a man who paid in cash and didn't ask questions. Sarah found work at a boarding house, mending clothes and helping with laundry. They rented separate rooms in the cheapest place they could find, tiny spaces barely bigger than closets, but they were clean and the landlady was kind. For 2 weeks they settled into a routine. Work during the day, shared meals in the evening, conversations that stretched long into the night. Sarah found herself looking forward to seeing Jack each evening, to hearing about his day, to sharing her own thoughts and observations. He made her laugh with stories about the strange customers at the garage. She made him think with questions about life and purpose. The California border came into view on a morning when the sun seemed gentler than it had been in weeks. Sarah pressed her face close to the missing window of Jack's car, breathing in air that smelled different somehow, less dusty and more alive. They had saved every penny they could from their 2 weeks in New Mexico, and now the promised land lay ahead of them. California, Jack said, glancing at Sarah with something like hope in his eyes. We made it, but the hope didn't last long. The first labor camp they encountered sat in a valley surrounded by orange groves that should have been beautiful, but instead felt threatening. Hundreds of tents and makeshift shelters crowded together in the dirt, creating a small city of desperation. Children with hollow cheeks played in the dust. Women hung laundry on lines strung between vehicles. Men sat in clusters, their faces hard with anger and hopelessness. Jack parked the car at the edge of the camp and they walked in slowly, taking in the scene. The smell hit Sarah first. Unwashed bodies, overflowing latrines, sickness and despair, all mixed together into something that made her stomach turn. Sweet Jesus, Jack whispered. This is worse than anything back east. An older woman approached them, her face weathered like old leather. You two just arrived? Yes, ma'am, Sarah answered. We heard there was work in the orchards. The woman laughed, but there was no humor in it. Work? Sure, there's work. If you want to pick fruit for 12 hours a day in the blazing sun for wages that won't buy you a decent meal, if you want to live in a tent with no running water and watch your children go hungry, then yes, there's plenty of work. Jack's jaw tightened. It can't be that bad. The newspapers back east, they said California needed workers, said they'd pay fair wages. The newspapers lied, the woman said flatly, or the growers lied to the newspapers. Doesn't much matter which. The truth is, there are 10 workers for every job, maybe 20. So the growers can pay whatever they want, because if you don't like it, there's 100 people behind you who are desperate enough to take it. Sarah felt her heart sink. They had come so far, survived so much. All for this? Over the next few days, the reality of their situation became painfully clear. Jack and Sarah decided to pose as husband and wife. It was easier that way, safer for Sarah, and helped them get housing in the married section of the camp. They found work picking oranges in the groves owned by a company that paid 20 cents for every box filled. It sounded reasonable until Sarah realized that filling a box required picking hundreds of oranges, climbing up and down ladders in the scorching heat, and working from sunrise until well past sunset. Her hands blistered within the first day. By the end of the first week, Her back ached constantly and her shoulders were burned despite the long sleeves she wore. Jack worked just as hard, pushing himself to fill as many boxes as possible, but even together they barely earned enough to buy food and pay the 50 cents a week rent for their tiny tent. The camp itself was a nightmare. Hundreds of families crowded into spaces meant for dozens. There was one water pump for every 50 families, and the lines to use it stretched long every morning and evening. The toilets were trenches dug in the ground, separated by gender, but offering little privacy or dignity. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Sarah saw children with running noses and burning fevers, old people coughing up blood, babies crying from hunger and illness. But what shocked Sarah most was the cruelty of the system. The growers employed foremen who walked through the orchards with clubs, watching the workers like prison guards. If someone worked too slowly, they were fired on the spot. If someone complained about conditions or wages, they were not only fired but blacklisted. Their names passed to other growers so they could never find work again. Sarah watched it all with growing anger. She saw mothers who looked like skeletons trying to nurse babies that wouldn't stop crying. She saw men who had once been proud farmers reduced to begging for scraps. She saw children who should have been in school instead working in the fields alongside their parents because every penny counted. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in the orchards, Sarah sat outside their tent watching the sunset. A young woman approached carrying a small child who looked deathly ill. The woman's eyes were desperate. "Please," she said to Sarah, "do you have any medicine? My baby, she's burning up with fever. I've been to the camp doctor, but he says he has nothing to give us unless we can pay." Sarah felt her heart break. "How much does he want?" $2. "I don't have $2. My husband just got fired for talking back to a foreman. We have nothing." Sarah looked at the sick baby, at the mother's desperate face, and made a decision. She went into the tent and pulled out the small tin where she and Jack kept their savings. Inside was $3.40, everything they had managed to save over 2 weeks of backbreaking work. When Jack returned from washing at the pump, Sarah told him what she had done. She expected anger, or at least frustration. Instead, Jack pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "We'll earn more. That baby needed help now." But the baby died 3 days later anyway. The medicine had been too little too late. Sarah stood at the small funeral they held in the camp, watching the mother weep over the tiny body wrapped in an old blanket, and something inside her hardened into steel. That night, Sarah began talking to the other workers. Quietly at first, just conversations about conditions and wages. She asked questions, listened to stories, and learned about the history of labor organizing. Some of the older workers remembered unions from before the Depression, remembered what it was like when workers stood together and demanded fair treatment. "We need to organize," Sarah said at a gathering of about 20 workers who met after dark behind the storage sheds. "We need to demand better wages, better conditions. They can't fire all of us. They can blacklist all of us," a man named Henry said bitterly. "Then what? We starve?" "We're starving now," Sarah countered. "Working 12 hours a day and still going to bed hungry? Watching our children get sick and die because we can't afford doctors. How is that any better than standing up for ourselves?" Jack stood beside her, not speaking but offering silent support with his presence. He had warned her privately that organizing was dangerous, that the growers had thugs who dealt with troublemakers. But he also understood why she had to do it. Her fire, her refusal to accept injustice, was part of who she was. He wouldn't ask her to change that, even if it scared him. Word of Sarah's organizing spread through the camp. Some people were inspired, joining the secret meetings and talking about striking for better wages. Others were scared, warning that they would all suffer if they made trouble. The camp became divided between those who thought change was possible and those who thought survival meant keeping your head down. The growers noticed the unrest. The foreman became more aggressive, threatening workers with immediate termination for even talking about wages. They brought in guards who patrolled the camp at night, watching for gatherings or meetings. The atmosphere became tense, dangerous. Sarah knew she should probably back down, should probably stop before things got worse. But every time she thought about quitting, she remembered that dead baby, that desperate mother. She remembered all the children with hungry eyes and the old people dying of preventable illnesses. She thought about her own mother, dead from pneumonia and heartbreak, and her father drinking himself into oblivion because he couldn't fight the dust. She was tired of accepting defeat, tired of watching good people suffer while those with power got richer. If she was going to be trouble, as Jack had called her that first day, then she would be trouble worth having. The meetings continued, growing larger despite the risks. Sarah wasn't just talking anymore. She was planning. They would strike at harvest time, when the fruit was ripe and needed to be picked quickly or it would rot. That's when they would have real power, when the growers stood to lose money if the oranges weren't harvested on schedule. Jack supported her but worried constantly. He had already lost everyone he loved, his wife, his brother, his old life. The thought of losing Sarah, too, of seeing her hurt, or worse, kept him awake at night. But he also admired her courage, her unwillingness to be broken by a system designed to crush people like them. They fell into a routine of work and organizing, of public compliance and private rebellion. During the day, they picked oranges and kept their heads down. At night, they met with other workers and made plans. Their relationship deepened through all of it. They were partners now, in every sense that mattered except one. Neither had spoken the words that hung between them, the feelings that grew stronger each day. Then one evening, after a particularly successful meeting where 30 workers had pledged to join the strike, Sarah and Jack walked back to their tent holding hands. The camp was quiet, most people already asleep. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright after the dust and darkness of the past months. "Sarah," Jack said suddenly, stopping outside their tent. "I need to tell you something." Sarah turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know we're living in terrible conditions, that tomorrow might be worse than today. But somewhere between that embarrassing moment behind a truck and now, I fell in love with you." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "You're the strongest, bravest, most stubborn person I've ever met, and I don't want to face whatever comes next without you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Happy tears this time, not tears of grief or frustration. "I love you too," she whispered. "Even though you found me in the most mortifying moment of my life." They kissed there in the darkness, two people who had lost everything finding something precious in each other. The trouble Sarah had been organizing finally caught up with them on a night when the moon hung like a pale coin in the dark sky. She and Jack had just finished another meeting with the workers where they had finalized plans for the strike that would begin in 1 week. 37 people had committed to walking off the job, and Sarah believed they could get 50 if they kept working on it. 50 workers refusing to pick during peak harvest would cost the growers real money. They would force them to listen. They were walking back through the rows of tents, keeping to the shadows as they always did after meetings, when Sarah heard the footsteps behind them. Heavy boots, multiple pairs, moving with purpose rather than the tired shuffle of exhausted workers heading to bed. "Keep walking," Jack whispered, his hand tightening on hers. "Don't run. Just walk normal." But normal wasn't an option anymore. The footsteps quickened, and suddenly there were men all around them. 3, maybe 4, Sarah couldn't tell in the darkness. They wore dark clothes and had bandanas pulled up over their faces, but she could see the clubs in their hands. "You the girl who's been causing trouble?" one of them asked, his voice rough and menacing. Sarah's throat went dry, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play stupid," another man said. "We know you've been organizing meetings, talking about strikes. The bosses don't like that. They sent us to give you a message." Jack stepped in front of Sarah, putting himself between her and the men. "Leave her alone. Whatever problem you have, you deal with me." "That's noble and all," the first man said. "But our orders are about the girl. You can walk away right now, friend." "This doesn't have to involve you." "I'm not walking away," Jack said firmly. What happened next was chaos and violence that Sarah would remember in fragments for the rest of her life. Jack swinging at the nearest man, connecting with his jaw. The sound of fists hitting flesh. Sarah screaming for help, but knowing no one would come. People in the camp had learned that interfering with the growers' business only brought more trouble. Jack fighting like a man possessed, managing to knock one of the attackers to the ground before the others overwhelmed him. Sarah tried to help, tried to pull one of the men off Jack, but someone grabbed her from behind. She bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth, tasting blood, and the man cursed and loosened his grip, just enough for her to break free. "Run!" Jack shouted at her, his voice thick with pain. "Sarah, run!" She ran. She hated herself for it, even as her legs carried her through the maze of tents. But she ran because Jack was giving her the chance, and she couldn't let that be for nothing. Behind her, she heard grunts and thuds, heard Jack cry out in pain that made her heart feel like it was tearing in half. She found Henry and 2 other men from their organizing meetings and brought them back, but by the time they arrived, the attackers were gone. Jack lay crumpled on the ground between 2 tents, his face bloody and swelling, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Oh God, Jack, no, no, no." Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hand shaking as she tried to assess his injuries. His left eye was swollen shut, his lip was split open, and when he tried to sit up, he cried out in pain and clutched his ribs. "I'm okay," he managed to say through gritted teeth, though clearly he was not okay. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You're the one who's hurt. We need to get you to a doctor." "Can't afford a doctor," Jack said, trying to smile but wincing instead. "Besides, nothing broken that won't heal. I've had worse." Henry and the others helped carry Jack back to his and Sarah's tent. They laid him on the thin mattress they used for a bed, and Sarah spent the night cleaning his wounds with their precious water supply, making cold compresses from rags and holding his hand while he drifted in and out of consciousness. By morning, Jack looked even worse. His face had swollen to the point where she barely recognized him, purple and black bruises covering his jaw and cheekbone. He could barely move without gasping in pain, and Sarah suspected he had at least 2 cracked ribs, maybe more. "We have to leave," she said as the sun came up, illuminating the terrible extent of his injuries. "We can't stay here. They'll come back, and next time they might kill you." "Where will we go?" Jack asked, his voice weak. "We have no money. The car barely runs. I can't even stand up without wanting to pass out." Sarah thought of the $3.40 they'd had saved before she gave it away for medicine that hadn't saved that baby anyway. They had managed to save another $1.20 since then. Not enough for gas, not enough for food, not enough for anything. But they couldn't stay. That much was clear. She spent the morning quietly talking to people they trusted, gathering what help she could. Henry gave them 2 cans of beans and a loaf of bread that was only slightly stale. Another woman gave them a blanket that didn't have too many holes. Someone else contributed 50 cents toward gas money. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it was given with love and solidarity. By afternoon, Jack could sit up without screaming, though the pain was clearly intense. Sarah helped him to the car, supporting most of his weight as he shuffled slowly across the camp. People watched them go with mixed expressions, some sympathetic, some relieved that the troublemakers were leaving, some scared that they might be targeted next. Sarah drove because Jack couldn't manage it. She had watched him drive enough times to understand the basics, though her first attempts at working the clutch were jerky and made Jack groan in pain as the car lurched forward. "Sorry," she said. "I'm trying." "You're doing fine," Jack said, though his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. "Just get us out of here." They drove north, away from the labor camps and the orange groves, away from the anger and violence. Sarah had no clear destination in mind, just away. The car made concerning noises every few miles, sputtering and coughing like it might give up entirely, but somehow it kept going. By evening they were in the countryside north of Sacramento, surrounded by rolling hills that were brown from the summer heat, but still somehow beautiful compared to the dust bowls they'd left behind. Sarah spotted an abandoned barn set back from the road, its roof mostly intact, and pulled the car behind it where it couldn't be seen from the highway. Jack was barely conscious by then, fever setting in from his injuries. Sarah helped him into the barn, made a bed from hay and the donated blanket, and spent the night bathing his forehead with a wet cloth and praying that he wouldn't get worse. For 3 days, they hid in that barn while Jack slowly healed. Sarah made the canned beans last, giving Jack the larger portions even though he protested. She found a creek nearby where she could fill their water bottle. She kept watch, terrified that someone would discover them, that the growers' thugs had somehow followed them. During the long hours when Jack slept and Sarah sat guard, she thought about everything that had happened. She thought about her choice to organize, about whether it had been worth it. Jack had been beaten because of her, because she couldn't accept injustice, because she had to try to change things even when change seemed impossible. "Stop blaming yourself," Jack said one afternoon, startling her. His eyes were open, both of them now, though one was still swollen and discolored. "I can see it on your face. You think this is your fault?" "It is my fault," Sarah said quietly. "You warned me it was dangerous. You told me to be careful, and I didn't listen." Jack shifted slowly, carefully, to look at her more directly. "Sarah, you were trying to help people who needed help. You were standing up against a system that grinds people into the dirt. That's not something to feel guilty about, but you got hurt because of me. I got hurt because some men with clubs didn't like the idea of workers being treated fairly," Jack corrected. "That's on them, not you. And you know what? I'd do it again. I'd take another beating if it meant protecting you and what you stand for." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Jack." "Don't be sorry. Be proud. You organized 37 people to stand together." "That's incredible." Jack reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "The world needs people like you, Sarah. People who won't back down, who won't accept things the way they are just because that's easier. You're exactly the kind of trouble this world needs." On the fourth day in the barn, Jack was strong enough to sit up without help. The swelling in his face had gone down considerably, though the bruises remained spectacular shades of purple and yellow. Sarah helped him walk around the barn slowly, rebuilding his strength. That afternoon, sitting in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the broken roof, Sarah felt suddenly dizzy and nauseous. She stumbled outside and was sick behind the barn, heaving up the few bites of beans she'd eaten for breakfast. Jack followed her out, moving slowly but steadily. "Are you all right? Did you eat something bad?" Sarah wiped her mouth, her mind racing as she counted back weeks. The nausea, the exhaustion she'd been attributing to stress and poor sleep, the way her body felt different lately. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh, Jack, no." He understood immediately, his eyes going wide. "You think you're—" "I'm late," Sarah said, her voice shaking. It should have almost 2 weeks ago." She looked at him with fear and wonder mixed together. "Jack, I think I'm pregnant." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of this news settling over them like another layer of trouble in lives already full of it. A baby. Broke, running from violence. They were going to have a baby. Finally, Jack started to laugh. It was a painful laugh, making him clutch his ribs, but it was genuine. "Well," he said, "I did call you trouble that first day. Seems I was more right than I knew." Despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing too. "What are we going to do?" Jack took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Same thing we've been doing. We'll figure it out. One day at a time, one problem at a time. Together. We can't raise a baby in a car or a barn." "No," Jack agreed. "So we find somewhere better. We find work that doesn't involve getting beaten up. We build something." He looked at her seriously. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? For real this time? Not just pretending for the camp?" Sarah felt her heart swell with love for this man who had found her at her lowest, who had protected her, who loved her fire even when it got them both in trouble. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 3 days later in a small church on the outskirts of Sacramento. The church was white-painted wood with a steeple that leaned slightly to one side, and the pastor was a gentle man named Reverend Williams who asked no questions when they showed up at his door with hardly 2 pennies to rub together. "Young people in love shouldn't wait," Reverend Williams said with a kind smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, "especially not in times like these. The world's uncertain enough without putting off the things that matter." Sarah wore the only dress she owned, the same faded blue cotton she'd been wearing since Oklahoma. She'd washed it in the creek and done her best to press it smooth with her hands. Jack had cleaned up as much as possible, though the bruises on his face were still visible, painted in fading yellows and greens. His shirt was patched and his pants were worn thin at the knees, but he stood straight and tall, and when he looked at Sarah, his eyes held nothing but love. The ceremony was simple. Reverend Williams read from a worn Bible, his voice steady and warm. There were no guests except for the pastor's wife, who served as witness and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the brief service. When Jack slipped a ring onto Sarah's finger, a thin band he'd fashioned himself from a piece of copper wire, carefully smoothed and shaped, she felt tears slip down her own cheeks. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Williams said. "Young man, you may kiss your bride." Jack kissed her softly, mindful of his still healing lip, and Sarah felt like maybe, despite everything, life might work out after all. The pastor's wife insisted they stay for supper, a simple meal of chicken soup and fresh bread that tasted like a feast after days of rationed beans. Over the meal, Jack explained that they were looking for work, anything honest that would help them get on their feet. "My husband works in the logging camps up north," Reverend Williams said thoughtfully. "Dangerous work, but it pays better than the orchards. They're always looking for men willing to work hard. The camps are rough, but some of them allow families. You might find something there." Jack's expression grew serious. "I've heard about the logging camps. Men die up there fairly regular." "They do," the Reverend acknowledged honestly. "But they also earn enough to feed their families. In times like these, a man does what he must." That night, sleeping in the church basement on blankets provided by the pastor's wife, Jack held Sarah close and talked about their options. The logging camps in Oregon were brutal. Everyone knew that. Men were crushed by falling trees, killed in accidents with machinery, crippled by injuries that never healed right. But the pay was real money, not the pennies the orchards offered. Real money that could rent a proper house, buy food, prepare for a baby. "I'll be careful," Jack promised, his hand resting gently on Sarah's still flat stomach. "I'll work hard and save every penny, and by the time this baby comes, we'll have something better than a tent or a barn. I can work too." Sarah said. "I won't just sit around while you risk your life." Jack kissed her forehead. "I know you won't. That's not who you are. But maybe you could work somewhere safer, at least until the baby comes?" Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could do anything he could do, but she thought about the tiny life growing inside her, about the responsibility they now carried together, and she nodded against his chest. They left for Oregon 2 days later, the car somehow still running despite all odds. The journey north took them through forest that seemed impossible after months in the dusty plains. Tall trees reaching toward the sky, the air cool and damp and smelling of pine and earth. Sarah pressed her face to the window, drinking in the greenery like someone dying of thirst. The logging camp they found was exactly as rough as advertised. Rows of simple cabins housed the workers and their families, rough structures made from leftover lumber with gaps between the boards that would let in the cold when winter came. But they were solid structures with real roofs, and after sleeping in tents and barns, they seemed almost luxurious. Jack found work immediately. The camp foreman, a massive man named Big Tom with hands like dinner plates, looked at Jack's wiry frame skeptically but nodded when Jack proved he could handle an axe. "You'll start on the cutting crews," Big Tom said. 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. Pay is $3 a day, minus 50 cents for cabin rent and another 50 cents for meals. You break something or get yourself killed, that's your problem, not mine. Understood? Understood, Jack said, and just like that, he was a logger. Sarah found work too, though it took longer. Most of the camp women stayed home tending to their families, but there was a need for someone to help the camp cook, a woman named Martha who was getting too old to handle all the work alone. The pay was minimal, $1 a day plus meals, but it was something, and it kept Sarah busy while Jack was in the forest. The work was hard for both of them. Jack came home each evening exhausted, his hands blistered and bleeding until they finally toughened into calluses. He had close calls regularly, a tree that fell the wrong way and nearly crushed him, a snapped cable that whipped past his head, missing him by inches. Each night Sarah examined him for new injuries, bandaged cuts, and thanked God he'd made it home alive one more day. Sarah's work in the kitchen was less dangerous, but no less exhausting. Maybe. She stood for hours preparing food for hungry loggers, her feet swelling and her back aching as her pregnancy progressed. Martha taught her to make meals stretch, how to make soup from bones and scraps, how to bake bread in the massive ovens, how to season cheap cuts of meat so they tasted like something better. But despite the hardship, something wonderful was happening. They were building a life. Every week, Jack handed Sarah his earnings, and they carefully divided the money, some for immediate needs, some tucked away in a tin can hidden under the floorboards of their cabin. The savings grew slowly but steadily. $2 one week, $3 the next, sometimes only $1 if unexpected expenses came up, but it grew. Sarah's belly grew too, rounding out gradually through the fall months. The other camp women noticed and offered advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, warnings about what to expect. Martha proved especially helpful, having raised 7 children of her own. She taught Sarah about pregnancy and childbirth, knowledge that was both reassuring and terrifying. Through the winter, as snow piled high around the camp and the work became even more dangerous with ice on the logs and frozen ground making footing treacherous, Jack and Sarah held tight to each other in their dreams. On Sunday mornings, their one day off, they would lie in bed and talk about the future. "When we've saved enough," Jack would say, his hand on Sarah's swollen belly, "we'll leave the camp. Find a small town somewhere, maybe open a repair shop. I'm good with, engines, good with my hands. We could make a decent living. I could teach," Sarah would add. "Not in a school, maybe, at least not at first. But I could teach children to read, tutor them in the evenings. Every child deserves an education. Our child will have one," Jack promised. "Our child will have everything we didn't. Stability, opportunity, a future that's more than just surviving." But Sarah had other dreams, too. Dreams she was almost afraid to speak aloud. Dreams of organizing again, but smarter this time, safer. Dreams of workers' cooperatives where people owned their own labor, where children didn't die from preventable illnesses, where families didn't have to choose between dignity and survival. She started small, quietly. On Sunday afternoons, she began teaching some of the camp children to read. A few mothers asked if she could teach them too, women who had never learned their letters and were ashamed of it. Sarah agreed, and soon she had a small group meeting in her cabin twice a week, hunched over borrowed books and scraps of paper, learning to read and write. The lessons became more than just literacy. They became discussions about fairness and rights, about how workers in other places had organized successfully, about the importance of education and knowledge. Sarah was careful, never pushing too hard, never doing anything that might bring the kind of violence they'd faced in California. But she was planting seeds, nurturing ideas, helping people understand their own worth. Jack watched with pride and a touch of fear. "You're doing it again," he said one evening after her students had left. "Organizing, teaching people to think differently." "I'm just teaching them to read," Sarah said innocently. "You're teaching them to think," Jack corrected. "And thinking people are dangerous to those who profit from keeping people down." He pulled her close as her pregnant belly would allow. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I can't lose you, Sarah. Not you, and not this baby." "I promise," she said, and she meant it. She had learned from California. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't stop being who she was, someone who saw injustice and couldn't stay silent. Burst of wildflowers and longer days. Sarah's belly had grown huge, making even simple tasks difficult. Martha finally insisted she stop working in the kitchen. "That baby's coming soon," Martha said firmly. "You need to rest. Save your strength. Trust me, you'll need it." Ugh. Sarah was secretly relieved. Her back ached constantly now, and her feet were so swollen she could barely fit them into her shoes. Jack had grown increasingly protective, worried about her doing too much, concerned about the birth that was rapidly approaching. On a warm evening in early May, when the sun hung low and golden through the trees, Sarah felt the first pain. She was hanging laundry outside their cabin when it hit, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. She gripped the clothesline, waiting for it to pass, and when it did, she knew. The baby was coming. Martha and 2 other experienced mothers came to help. They boiled water, prepared clean cloths, and settled Sarah on the bed while Jack paced outside like a caged animal. The labor was long and difficult. Sarah had never experienced pain like this, wave after wave that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. "You're doing fine," Martha encouraged, wiping Sarah's forehead with a cool cloth. "Just breathe through it. Won't be long now, but it was long. Hours that stretched into what felt like days. Pain that made her cry out and grip the hands of the women helping her. She thought about her mother, who had gone through this 7 times. She thought about all the women throughout history who had done this, who had brought life into the world through sheer determination and strength. Finally, as the dawn light began creeping through the cabin windows, Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to push. The women encouraged her, guided her, and then suddenly there was a cry, high and loud and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Martha announced, her face breaking into a huge smile. "A beautiful, healthy girl." They cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a soft blanket that one of the women had knitted, then placed her in Sarah's exhausted arms. Sarah looked down at the tiny face, at the perfect little fingers and the eyes that squinted against the light, and felt love so fierce it hurt. Jack was brought in, his face pale and anxious until he saw them both alive and well. He knelt beside the bed, tears streaming openly down his cheeks as he touched his daughter's impossibly small hand. "She's perfect," he whispered. "What should we name her?" Sarah thought about their journey, from that embarrassing moment behind a truck in the dust, through the hardships and violence, the hunger and fear, the love and determination that had brought them to this moment. She thought about what had kept them going through everything,